governance, and as the world passes through an era of unprecedented disruption at every level, the corporate leaders as well as the policy makers need to navigate the challenges of today and tomorrow. In pursuit of our goals, the Foundation will be hosting series of webinars to constantly bring to the fore topics which require serious deliberations. Today, we proudly host the first international webinar of this series on the topic Corporate Social Responsibility and COVID-19. The topic will be deliberated upon by Dr. Gerhard Schneider and Professor Jay Prakash Sharma. It is heartening to see eminent luminaries from the world of academics, as is visible from the list of the participants. We welcome you all, and we hope you will give positive inputs to the entire after the webinar is over. The objective of this webinar is to throw light on corporate social responsibility as a potential policy tools in the hands of the state, and how corporate social responsibility policies be actively shaped to achieve the desired social and environmental outcomes. Given the turbulence in all spheres of human existence due to the pandemic, the topic is a relevant one. I would now like to invite Dr. Gerhard Schneider to share his views on the subject. Dr. Gerhard Schneider is a PhD in political science from University of Lausanne, Switzerland. He is currently the Director, International Management at Loughborough University, London, and Research Associate at the Centre for Business Research, University of Cambridge. Previously, he worked at King's College London, the University of Bath, and the Centre for Diplomacy and International Studies, SOAS, University of London. His current research work focuses on the state business relationships and non-market strategies, especially in countries with weak legal institutions. Recent studies on these topics have been published in Organization Studies, Business and Society, Global Strategy Journal, and Journal of International Management. Over to you, Dr. Schneider.
Thank you so much, Professor. It's really a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be able to share my thoughts with you today, and very much look forward to your comments on what I have to say. So I'll try to share my PowerPoint. And I think I'll turn off my camera at the same time to make sure this is going smoothly. So you don't need to see me, obviously, during my presentation. So that's done. Okay, so I'm not sure if I will see the chat if you have any queries during the talk, but perhaps just unmute your microphone and interrupt me if you have any questions of clarification. So again, thank you very much, Professor Sharma, for inviting me to do this talk. This is essentially going to be based on recent research I've done with colleagues at the Institute for International Management in London at the Loughborough University, London. I'm the director of that institute. We're a fairly new institute. We've been around now for 3 years, and we're trying to establish a sort of center of competence in the study of multinationals from and into emerging markets here in London. So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to connect with your organization in India, which is one of the countries we're particularly interested in. So the talk I would like to do today is focusing on CSR mostly in Anglo-Saxon countries, especially the UK, but with a little bit on the US as well. I would like to start by just summarizing a little bit what we know so far about how the COVID-19 pandemic is likely to affect CSR. I've spoken to several colleagues who study this topic and are currently also interviewing CSR professionals in the UK. And sort of the picture that's emerging is that currently many companies adopt mainly symbolic measures of the sort that CEOs and executives of the corporations are agreeing to pay cuts, quite major pay cuts, in a sort of a symbolic move to show solidarity with people who have lost their jobs or are on furlough at the moment and hence not receiving a full salary. Other than that, there has been an observation that corporations have increased philanthropic spending towards hospitals, for instance, or elderly people's homes. Oftentimes, these donations are actually in kind, so corporations donating materials to these hospitals rather than giving them cash. So these are some of the things that UK companies in particular have started doing in the current crisis. There have been more substantive measures as well, including various companies such as Dyson, but also small distilleries, gin distilleries in particular, having tried to switch their business model to actively fight the pandemic in a sense. And so Dyson, for instance, has famously offered the government to start producing ventilators. 58 Gin, for instance, a small brewery in London, or a distillery in London, for instance, has switched to producing hand sanitizer. These are not necessarily purely CSR related practices in the sense that the distilleries, for instance, obviously, given that bars are closed and that people are staying at home, have lost market share or have lost their clientele. So shifting to hand sanitizers does mean that they have a new income stream in a sense. So it's not purely CSR in the sense of philanthropy, that what they're doing, but they're trying to contribute to the fight against COVID-19. However, people have noted that these measures so far have been largely inefficient, or at least not as effective as it was initially thought. And indeed, one of my former colleagues, Gabriela Gutierrez, has written a blog on this, on the current situation and how the CSR activities that are happening right now are not necessarily achieving the goals they're meant to achieve. So this is what we know. It's obviously early days to know how exactly CSR is being affected by COVID. Longer term, I think Professor Sharma has asked me to talk about whether the crisis is an opportunity for corporations to rethink their responsibility towards shareholders, stakeholders, or whether it's just becoming an extra burden for them. I think, to me, the short answer is that CSR spending is considered by most corporations, at least in the UK, as non-essential spending. And just like after other crises, such as the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we can expect that there will be a massive decline in spending on CSR from corporations. And indeed, again, my colleague, Gabi Gutierrez-Huertero, has done some interviews with people from CSR departments in UK companies, and most of them actually have been furloughed, meaning that they're not currently working. They've been put on the government scheme for not unemployed, but temporarily unemployed, meaning that it really is one of the first things that corporations seem to cut as the crisis, the pandemic, starts to transform into an economic crisis. So my view is really on this specific question of whether corporations take this as an opportunity to rethink their responsibility towards stakeholders or as an extra burden. In the medium term, I think it will be very much considered as an extra burden, and we can expect CSR spending to go down considerably. However, I would like to make, in the remainder of my time here, I would like to make the point that perhaps the pandemic actually has a more fundamental, longer term effect on CSR, in the sense that CSR may be transformed by a change in the relationship between the state and the private economy, at least not in all countries perhaps, but at least in many of the Anglo-Saxon countries. And in a sense, to make this point, to give you some thoughts about these questions, whether CSR may indeed be more fundamentally transformed, I would like to focus on the case of Anglo-America, in particular, hence the US and the UK. So what you can see here, this is a table from Worldometers that records, the cases of COVID in the world. I took this about 3 days ago, and you can see Brazil is here still lagging behind the UK. Obviously, Brazil is catching up with the UK in terms of total number of people who have died at the rate of 1,000 people a day. So within a few days now, I think I checked this morning, and Brazil and the UK are now head to head, both more or less at 40,000 people who have died, reported people, I should add. Regardless of that, I mean, what this table shows you is that the COVID crisis has hit the US and the UK particularly hard compared to comparable countries such as for the UK, France, for instance, or Spain or Germany. The UK has had a harder time fighting the pandemic than other European countries of similar size. The US is in a league of its own with an extremely high number of deaths. And to some extent, this is not necessarily a surprise to me, but it also indicates that these two countries have actually most lessons to learn from the pandemic. And that's where I see a link with changes to CSR. So let me explain how I see the effect of COVID-19 on Anglo-America. Two things I think have struck me most in the past 3 months since COVID-19 has become a serious topic in these two countries. One is that people start realizing that actually there is such a thing as society. And secondly, that the state is actually the solution to our problem, not the problem. I'll come back to that in a second. To me, these two realizations amongst politicians in the US and the UK in particular sort of indicates that there might be quite a lasting effect of COVID-19 on the way in which the state relates to the economy in our countries. Indeed, I would like to make the case that this may indeed affect CSR practices of corporations after the crisis. Now, the realization I mentioned about, that people realize that there is actually such a thing as society, this is referring to a quote from our Prime Minister Boris Johnson. You probably all know that back in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher here on the left famously declared in an interview that there was no such thing as a society, that there are only individuals and families. David Cameron in 2010 declared in his inaugurational speech that society was actually the solution to our problems as opposed to big government. So he had the slogan of the big society, which was quite a turn away from Thatcherism. But what he meant by big society, in a sense, is a society that takes over typically state government roles and that replaces, in a sense, the government. So society was acknowledged, but it was understood to be something that replaces the state rather than works in conjunction with the state. Boris Johnson very recently, when he left the hospital after having been very ill with COVID-19 himself, declared that if there's one thing that this crisis has shown, it is that there is such a thing as society in the UK. I'm not quite sure as often with our Prime Minister's declarations what he wanted to say with that, but in a sense it's very telling that the COVID pandemic has shown to many people in this country, in the UK, where I'm speaking from, that indeed people do have quite large embedded a strong embedding in their local communities, that they are embedded in communities, look after each other, and have relationships with neighbors and families and friends, which obviously seems very obvious to say, but in the UK, I think this is something that many people didn't expect to happen, the sort of helping each other in this crisis. I've heard Michael Sandel from Harvard, for instance, say similar things about the US, declaring that it's in times of crisis that Americans discover their sense of solidarity, for instance. So there's an effect of people realizing, actually, you know, there is something beyond the market. There's people who are connected and embedded in relationships. So this is a first realization that quite struck me when, and you can see Boris Johnson, you know, his declaration actually was even commented on in the conversation, for instance. So it is quite considered to be quite an important moment in the evolution of our country. The other aspect, the other thing that has happened with COVID-19 is sort of a realization that perhaps the state is actually quite useful. And I will contrast that with the last 40 years of libertarian policies towards the state, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries and especially in the UK and the US. Many of you may remember Reagan's declaration in his inaugural speech that the government is not the solution to our problem, but the government is the problem. That sort of Reaganism, Thatcherism obviously kicked off 40 years of very conscientious or very targeted attempts to reduce the size of government, to reduce its role in the economy and society, and essentially to shrink it. Indeed, Grover Norquist, who is one of the key leaders of an association called Americans for Tax Reform, which very close to the Tea Party, he had this famous quote, which many of you may be familiar with, that where he declared that I do not want to abolish government. I simply want to reduce it to the size where I can drag it into the bathroom and drown it in the bathtub. So this was about 15 years ago. And this sort of libertarian thinking of anarcho-capitalist thinkers that, you know, essentially were trying to promote policies that were killing off the state by reducing taxes, by reducing state spending. They have very much informed, obviously, what the current administration in the US is doing. Trump has adopted the decree 13771, which essentially prescribes the one in, two out rule, which refers to regulations. We have a similar thing in the UK, which means for every single regulation that you adopt, you need to get rid of two other ones. So a clear attempt to deregulate society and the economy and to reduce the role of the state in the economy. I could add hundreds of examples of similar things. The other aspect of this shrinking the government obviously is the conscious underfunding of government services, of public services. And in the UK, we've had one of the most extreme phases of austerity following the global financial crisis. From 2010 to 2019, George Osborne had adopted a plan of cutting £81 billion of government spending over that decade. So a very drastic reduction of funding for government services. And this is related to the pandemic that we're facing right now. Andrew Lansley is the person responsible for the last big reform of the NHS, the National Health Service. He's the one who created the Public Health England well, it's a part of the administration who looks after the NHS now. And so he's sort of credited for that reform, and there's a huge debate around the reform that he introduced in 2013, I think it was, whether that reform actually is responsible for the high death rate in the UK compared to other countries, which I showed you the statistics before. So there's a clear link between the underfunding of the NHS, the reforms that are trying to reduce the size of the state and the capability of our country to react to it. Austerity, Mark Blythe from Brown College declares, is a dangerous idea. And I think the Washington Post has sort of put it on the spot when they declared, referring to Norquist's quote, "When you drown the government in a bathtub, people die." So I feel that what the crisis sort of tells people currently is that perhaps we have been too pessimistic about the role of government in society, and that indeed, contrary to Reagan's declaration, in some cases, government actually is the solution rather than the problem. Again, I give you one example here from the Washington Post, but the papers in the UK are full of, indications that there is something changing in terms of how we look at the state. And this sort of leads me to CSR more specifically. I mean, what do these two changes, these two trends have to do with CSR? Well, in my view, CSR is broadly a question of what is the division of labor between the state and the economy, right? And indeed, while CSR scholars oftentimes focus on corporate CSR practices, there's a big role for the state to shape the way CSR is structured in a country. There's not that much literature on this. One paper by Jean-Pascal Gonde from City University in London as well, with his colleagues from 2011, is one of the few that actually looks at the role of the state in CSR. And they distinguish 5 different types of roles that the state can play in CSR, or relationships between the state and CSR. The first one they distinguish is CSR as self-government. That, in a sense, is any private initiative, such as, I don't know if you're familiar with certain fair trade labels, such as Max Havelaar in Europe, for instance. These sort of industry standards that promise, for instance, that coffee farmers or tea farmers get a fair price for their produce. These are purely private initiatives. The state doesn't really care about them, and CSR happens as a form of self-government by companies in reaction to, for instance, consumer demand. The second way in which government influences CSR is by facilitating it. So this is sort of a light touch approach of governments to CSR, where the government can encourage companies to become socially responsible through rhetoric or through education, providing online resources for companies to draw on, organizing conferences about CSR where they invite companies in order to try and educate them to become more socially responsible. Third way in which government can influence CSR is what Gonde et al. Call the CSR as partnership model, whereby the government becomes more active in trying to get companies on board to solve certain social issues in the country. This can happen, for instance, through private-public partnerships and so forth. While the fourth way in which government influences CSR is more interventionist. This is what they call CSR as mandated by government. So this means that here companies, for instance, governments, for instance, take up good practice in CSR that companies have adopted and turn them into law. There's a Journal of Business Ethics article from 2005 by Russo, who shows that this has happened, for instance, in certain African countries where companies voluntarily adopt CSR standards, and the government then takes them up and turns them into law, applies them to all companies. Government can also play such a more interventionist role in CSR through state ownership of companies, which can then be forced to adopt certain CSR practices. And then the fifth, and probably one of the most well-known case of CSR government relationships, is sort of flipping it on its head. And that's what Scherer and Palazzo, for instance, have called political CSR or PCSR, which is the classical case where, as a result of the trends that I described earlier of shrinking government spending, where companies take over certain functions from government and become active in areas where before the government had a public service provider taking on these tasks. So this is what is normally called the economization of the political, meaning that the political realm, provision of health services, for instance, becomes a matter of private companies' CSR activities rather than the state. So this economization of the political has led to a huge literature on political CSR and is fairly well studied. But what is much less well studied is the opposite direction, which I'm very much interested in, which is the politicization of the economic. So rather than companies increasingly becoming active to replace states in their basic functions, there is increasing evidence that there are cases where governments become increasingly interventionist in the area of CSR in order to use CSR as a policy tool to actively shape what corporations do in terms of CSR and hence to achieve certain outcomes. So this is the topic of the paper that I co-authored with my colleagues, Alan Brainhold, Luda Sristunova, and Jukka Rintamäki, which is forthcoming in the Oxford Handbook of State Capitalism. And what we're sort of interested in is, in a sense, cases where governments, mandate certain CSR practices, or rather what we're interested in really is this question, which features of a given state, of a state as a government system, determines what sort of approach the state adopts towards CSR practices. And here, we sort of distinguish, based on Gondetal's work and on other sort of works in political science and other areas of management studies, we sort of distinguish essentially the means that the state uses in order to influence CSR and the ends that it attempts to achieve by intervening in CSR. So what we look at in terms of the means, the first type of or broad determinant of the state's attitude towards CSR is its capacity. So the state capacity in the sense of how well funded is it, how good is its public service, how good is its administration, how effective are they, what's the level of corruption, so forth. So this, in our view, determines to an important extent how the state will act in the area of CSR. The second one we look at is the locus of power. This is from Gondetal. What they mean by that essentially is whether CSR is mainly a legal matter, it's enshrined in the law, or whether it's purely voluntary. So it's something companies do if they feel like it, in a sense. And the third aspect of a state that we look at is the type of state intervention. So whether the state intervenes in a direct or an indirect way. Direct ways meaning, again, mandating things or even owning companies to make them do what the state wants. Indirect ones would be regulations and so forth. The ends that we think states can pursue can be either public or private. And I'll actually explain that when I come to my next slide here. So this is from our paper, and I'm not going to go, don't worry, I'm not going to go through it in any detail. What I want to focus on is precisely the left-hand side here in the frame of state means and the ends that the state might pursue. So both America, so the US I should say, and the UK are typically considered to be type of regulatory state. So I'm not going to go into these types of states. Those of you who are interested can look at the paper. So that's what we try to do in the paper. We try to figure out how different types of states, what's the most likely approach that these will take towards CSR. As I said, before the crisis, the US and the UK would typically be considered as regulatory states. Regulatory states are states that are capable, the US and the UK are rich countries, they have strong public services, but they obviously voluntarily choose to limit the state capability through things like austerity and underfunding of state services. So it's a conscious attempt to, sort of limit state capability to leave more space for private action. The locus of power in regulatory states is typically voluntary. So companies are left to do CSR if they feel like it. It's rarely mandated by the government. The sort of predominant way of the government to intervene in the economy is indirect, through regulation. So this is the typical steering, not rowing attitude of liberal governments towards the economy. Rather than directly intervening in the economy, it does so indirectly by just being an arbiter between private companies who play the games. And then in terms of the ends, we distinguish private goods from public goods. So in the typical regulatory state, the goal of state intervention in CSR is not to achieve any given public outcome. It's rather to enable private actors to pursue the goals that they set for themselves. Typical liberal attitude towards the economy and society. So this is different from other types of states, which I'm not going into, for instance, where the public good, the goal might be to achieve a given public goal, such as eliminating unemployment. In a regulatory state, unemployment will be eliminated as the result of private actions, as a trickle-down effect of a good economy, not as direct state intervention. So this is broadly our framework that we develop in that paper. And I would just like to spend the last few minutes that I have reflecting a little bit on how this will pan out after the crisis in these two countries, the US and especially the UK. So what can we expect in terms of how this picture might change of the regulatory state after COVID? One thing that we will for sure witness is that state capacity will decrease in the sense that there will be a new wave of austerity. We're spending billions and billions on saving companies at the moment, on saving people from unemployment. This money will have to be recouped, and this will lead to budgetary cuts in the public sector, meaning that basically the state will lose further resources to do things in the economy. In terms of the locus of power, our second dimension, what has happened, as I said before, is that the state is increasingly seen as a useful instrument to solve certain problems. And as such, in the population, it has gained legitimacy. That's not the same as saying that people are happy with Boris Johnson's handling of the COVID crisis. The government itself may not have gained legitimacy, but every Thursday we stand on our balcony, we clap for the NHS. You can see in London, in all the windows, there are posters saying, "Thank you, NHS." There's a great pride actually in the National Health Service. So in a sense, the public sector has gained legitimacy thanks to the crisis in a sense. And hence the power may have shifted somewhat from private companies towards the state as a legitimate actor in this area of CSR, which would lead me to sort of expect that the state may move away a bit from the voluntary approach that's typical in the UK. I'll come back to that in a minute. The type of intervention may also change. One thing that is happening currently is that the state has to intervene more directly in the economy, of course. One thing that is being discussed every day now on the radio, for instance, is that the state is again becoming a major owner in the economy, which obviously in the UK it isn't in normal times. But just like during the global financial crisis, the state will have to take over ownership of companies if it doesn't want them to go bankrupt. Due to these bailouts, the state will be much more present in the economy than it is currently. Similarly, there are already pushes which are not necessarily directly related to COVID-19, but they're sort of facilitated by them for the UK government to be more interventionist in the economy. One interesting change that has happened 2 weeks ago is that there's a new discussion of having more state powers to oppose foreign takeovers of private firms. That's particularly targeted at China, who are standing on the sidelines waiting for companies to get into financial troubles in order to buy them up. The UK government now wants powers that can allow it to oppose that sort of takeovers. That's a very unusual move for the UK government, which has had the most liberal takeover regime in the world for decades. In terms of ends, I think the ends will also shift away from the focus on private goods alone towards public goods. One of the reasons for this is that the UK and the US are countries that have recently experienced political earthquakes, such as the vote for Brexit and Trump's election, which already indicate that there's a huge amount of dissatisfaction, discontent in the population. This will only get worse with COVID-19. In the UK, people predict unemployment will go up to 1980s levels. In the US, it will be back up to 9% by the end of the year. People will become more discontent. And I think this will encourage states to focus more on public goals, public goods, such as employment, rather than just letting companies do what they see fit, in a sense. And the second element here is what I referred to above, the fact that there is a sense of people rediscovering society, as it were, people understanding that actually the individualistic approach to society from the 1980s is probably a thing of the past, and perhaps there's a role for the state in providing public goods, for instance. So I'm expecting changes in these areas. So if I just for a second go back to this framework that we developed, in a sense, on each one of these, I would expect some changes to take place, and the UK and the US to move into a different direction than it has been currently going into. The trends are contradictory. As I said, state intervention seems more legitimate than in the past 40 years, but of course, state capacity will be undermined. This in itself may actually encourage the government, the state, to become more interventionist in CSR and actually mandate companies to do things for society that the government cannot do anymore. The question obviously is whether the UK and the US will remember after the crisis is over, which isn't going to be the case for a number of months still, but whether the importance of the state will once again be forgotten when austerity comes back, when the need for budgetary cuts comes back, or whether COVID-19 will leave a lasting impression and will sort of shift these two countries towards a focus on the public good, lead the public to demand some sort of rebalancing between the state, the economy, and the society, meaning that the hands-off approach that the state has had and the underfunding of state services may actually be changed. In terms of CSR, I do expect to see more of this politicization of the economy, in the sense that the state may have more incentives now to turn towards private companies and have them take on state roles, as the state can't afford to spend money on certain services anymore. But as a result, the type of CSR that we will see is likely to be more directive, more mandatory, rather than voluntary, which will be a major change in the UK system and the US system as well. These are all speculations, and as one smart person once said, we can predict everything except the future. So I'm not saying that these predictions are accurate. These are based on my analysis of the situation, and this is my best guess of what we can expect for CSR after the crisis. I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to hand back over to the organizers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schneider, for that thought-provoking lecture. It has indeed raised a lot of questions. And I believe this particular problem of the pandemic is a global problem and definitely needs a global address. And given the fact that we have the government as one, or probably the state as one of the major stakeholders who can make a difference But apparently, given the economic downturn and other issues, most of the economies will have to do hand holding with each other. And CSR in that light will have to be very different from what we have seen in recent past. And as you said, how the society and the state has to do hand holding definitely is the way forward for the economies. Particularly in the light of this, the CSR will be one which will be more mandatory and directive in nature. So now, thank you very much, Dr. Schneider. I
Thank you
would
very
now
much.
like to request our second speaker, Professor Jayaprakash Sharma, who is currently the founding chairperson of Global Research Foundation for Corporate Governance. He is the former head and dean, Faculty of Commerce and Business at the Delhi School of Economics, University of Delhi, India. His academic contributions to the field of corporate governance and law is well known. I would now request Professor Sharma to take the discussion further and, in particular, look at the Indian perspective. Over to Professor Jayaprakash Sharma.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone present here. It's indeed a matter of pride for all of us that such a renowned speaker, Professor Schneider, he agreed to deliver a talk on the subject which is most talked about these days. Thank you, Professor Schneider. I first met him in a very big conference which was attended by, I think, more than 500 participants. And he was the keynote speaker in that conference. I was impressed the way he handled queries in that conference. Again met him last year in winter in London, and we had a discussion for about 2 hours at his office. And I proposed that, maybe we would be inviting either in a conference or some other event. Readily agreed. Now, not going into all those details, my presentation may be around 20 minutes, 25 minutes maximum. And I would be focusing on Indian model of CSR, pre-COVID and during COVID. Is that fine? The Indian model of CSR pre-COVID and post-COVID. Now,